Ma'am, we can't just move people around because they changed their mind about seats. The gate agent's voice carried that practiced dismissal that comes from years of shutting down passenger requests before they fully formed. Miguel Santos didn't look up from his phone as he spoke, his fingers still scrolling through social media, while the woman in the gray hoodie stood patiently at his counter. Amara Brooks adjusted her backpack and studied the man who had just become her first case study. At 42, she'd learned to read people quickly, and Miguel was an open book written in the language of indifference. His name tag hung slightly crooked, his uniform wrinkled from a long shift, and his attention split between his job and whatever was happening on his screen. "I didn't change my mind," Amara said calmly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that Miguel completely missed. "The system assigned me a middle seat during check-in. I'm just asking if there are any aisles available since the flight isn't full." Miguel finally glanced up, his eyes scanning her joggers, sneakers, and oversized sweatshirt with barely concealed disdain. She looked like every other budget traveler trying to upgrade for free, and he'd dealt with dozens of them today. "The flight is completely full," he said, though they both knew he hadn't checked. "If you wanted a specific seat, you should have paid the selection fee like everyone else. Before we dive deeper into this story of power prejudice and the moment when assumptions become consequences, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you've ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with, this story is for you." Amara stepped aside, but she didn't walk away. Instead, she found a spot near the boarding podium where she could observe her executive training kicking in automatically. For the next 15 minutes, she watched Miguel Santos conduct a master class in selective service. When Harrison Walsh, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, approached about upgrading his wife to first class, Miguel's entire demeanor transformed. His back straightened, his smile appeared, and his voice took on a tone of helpful efficiency. "Absolutely, Mr. Walsh. Let me see what I can do for you." Within minutes, Harrison's wife was moved to 3A no fee mentioned. A young Hispanic family approached next, clearly confused about baggage policies. Miguel's voice returned to its default setting of bureaucratic hostility. "The weight limit is 50 pounds, no exceptions. You'll have to repack or pay the overage fee." He pointed toward a corner where other frustrated travelers sat, surrounded by open suitcases, frantically redistributing belongings. Then came Sarah Mitchell, a blonde woman in designer jeans who'd missed her boarding group. "Oh, Miguel," she said, reading his name tag with practiced charm. "I was in the restroom. Could you possibly let me board with the next group?" Miguel's laugh was warm, conspiratorial. "Of course, Sarah. No problem at all." Amara made mental notes of everything. The name Miguel Santos would go in her report along with timestamps and detailed observations. Miguel had no idea that the woman in the gray hoodie he'd dismissed was Amara Brooks, the newly appointed CEO of Skyline Airways, conducting her first undercover assessment of the company she now owned. Her appointment had been finalized just 72 hours ago, after an 8-month selection process that had been kept strictly confidential. The board assumed she'd spend her first week flying in the corporate jet touring headquarters and meeting senior executives in boardrooms. Amara had different plans. Skyline Airways was hemorrhaging passengers' revenue and reputation. Customer satisfaction scores were at an all-time low. Social media buzzed with complaints about rude staff and poor service, and their stock price reflected investor concerns about the airline's culture problem. The previous CEO had insisted the negative feedback was just vocal minorities and competitor manipulation. Amara knew better. Data without context was useless, and the best context was standing right here in Gate K-17, watching her own employees treat customers like inconveniences rather than the reason for their paychecks. Her ticket booked under her unmarried name, Amara Hill, was for seat 26C on flight SL847 to San Francisco. She'd deliberately chosen the worst possible seat assignment to experience exactly what her most frustrated customers experienced daily. Now boarding Group 4, Miguel announced over the intercom, his voice carrying none of the warmth he'd shown preferred passengers. Amara joined the tired-looking crowd, shuffling toward the jet bridge. Her backpack contained only the essentials: water, a protein bar, and a yellow legal pad that was already filling with observations that would reshape Skyline Airways from the ground up. She had no idea how much worse things were about to get. The gate area buzzed with the usual pre-boarding chaos. Travelers checked their phones obsessively, families corralled restless children, and business passengers typed furiously on laptops trying to squeeze in a few more minutes of productivity before takeoff. Amara noticed an elderly couple struggling with their carry-on bags near the boarding line. The woman looked anxious, constantly checking boarding passes and whispering urgently to her husband, who seemed confused about the process. Other passengers stepped around them impatiently, but no Skyline employee offered assistance. She made another note. Staff training clearly doesn't emphasize proactive customer service. As she approached the jet bridge, Amara overheard Miguel on the phone with someone, his voice carrying that same dismissive tone she'd experienced. Yeah, another one of those entitled types wanting free upgrades. Dressed like she's going to the gym expecting first-class treatment. The casual cruelty of his comment hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was contempt for the people who kept the airline in business. Miguel had just insulted his new CEO to a colleague completely unaware that his career was about to take a dramatic turn. Amara stepped onto the aircraft, a CEO disguised as a regular passenger about to discover just how broken her airline really was. The plane's interior was dimly lit and stuffy, filled with the familiar scent of recycled air and industrial cleaning products. Flight attendants clustered near the front galley, chatting animatedly, while passengers struggled with overhead bins and seat assignments. She had no idea that in the next few hours she would witness behavior so appalling that it would make national news, destroy careers, and ultimately transform an entire industry's approach to passenger dignity. The revolution was about to begin with a laugh. The aircraft's interior felt like stepping into a pressure cooker. The air conditioning system wheezed and groaned, fighting a losing battle against the heat generated by hundreds of bodies and the California sun beating down on the metal fuselage. Amara shuffled down the narrow aisle, jostled by passengers wrestling oversized bags into overhead compartments, while flight attendants remained conspicuously absent from the boarding chaos. She could hear them before she could see them. Two female voices drifted from the front galley, their tone casual and gossipy, completely detached from the struggle unfolding in the cabin behind them. As Amara passed row 8, she caught her first glimpse of the crew that would become central to her story. Brenda Martinez stood with her back to the passengers, holding court like a queen in her domain. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence of an 18-year veteran who'd seen everything the airline industry could throw at her. Her perfectly styled auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, every strand in place, and her uniform was impeccable. She spoke with animated gestures, clearly the dominant personality in any room she entered. "Can you believe they're cutting the beverage service on flights under 2 hours?" Brenda was saying to her colleague. "Like we don't have enough angry passengers already. Now they want us to explain why a bottle of water costs $8. Beside her stood Carmen Rodriguez, 26 years old and still new enough to the job that her uniform looked slightly uncomfortable. She nodded along with Brenda's complaints, but her attention kept drifting to the passengers streaming past their galley. Carmen's dark eyes showed the uncertainty of someone still learning the unwritten rules of airline culture. "I know, right," Carmen replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's like they want us to deal with all the complaints while management sits in their offices." Amara continued moving toward her seat, but her trained ear caught every word. She recognized the classic dynamic immediately, a senior employee shaping the attitudes of a junior colleague, passing down years of accumulated cynicism and customer resentment like a toxic inheritance. The passenger in front of her stopped suddenly, creating a human traffic jam in the aisle. A businessman in seat 12D was struggling to lift his heavy bag into the overhead bin, sweat beading on his forehead as other passengers grew impatient behind him. The man looked around desperately for help, but the flight attendants remained absorbed in their conversation. "Excuse me," the businessman called toward the galley. "Could I get some assistance here?" Brenda glanced over with barely concealed annoyance. "Sir, passengers are responsible for their own carry-on luggage. It's in the safety briefing." Carmen shifted uncomfortably, taking a half step toward the struggling passenger before Brenda's sharp look stopped her cold. The message was clear: we don't coddle passengers. Amara watched the exchange with growing concern. This wasn't just poor customer service. It was a deliberate culture of indifference that started at the top and trickled down through every interaction. Finally reaching row 26, Amara found her assigned seat and immediately understood why Miguel Santos had been so confident about the flight being completely full. Seat 26C was a nightmare that would have challenged even the most patient traveler. The middle seat cushion was stained with what looked like spilled coffee, but the brown liquid had taken on a crusty, dried appearance that suggested it had been there for days. Crumbs were ground deep into the fabric, and the armrests were sticky with residue from previous passengers' food and drinks. The seatback pocket bulged with garbage-used tissues, empty snack wrappers, and a partially eaten sandwich that was beginning to emit a sour odor. But the real horror was the tray table. When Amara lowered it to examine the damage, she discovered a surface that hadn't been cleaned in recent memory. Dried food particles created a topographical map of previous meals, and something sticky had hardened into amber-colored patches that would require industrial-strength cleaning products to remove. This wasn't just the end-of-day messiness that comes from heavy use. This was neglect so comprehensive that it bordered on a health hazard. James Taylor, a 35-year-old travel blogger seated across the aisle in 26D, had been documenting his Skyline Airways experience for his YouTube channel when he noticed Amara's predicament. He'd flown hundreds of routes for his travel reviews, but even he was shocked by what he was seeing. "That's absolutely disgusting," he said loud enough for other passengers to hear. "How did that pass any kind of cleaning inspection?" James pulled out his phone and began recording, narrating quietly. "This is seat 26C on Skyline Airways Flight 847, and I've honestly never seen anything this bad on a commercial aircraft. The passenger who was assigned this seat has every right to be outraged." Other passengers began to notice the commotion. A woman in row 25 wrinkled her nose at the smell wafting from Amara's seatback pocket. A teenager in 27A took a photo and immediately started typing on his phone, his expression a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Amara stood in the aisle, surveying the biohazard that was supposed to be her seat for the next 5 hours. She could have revealed her identity right then, could have called for a supervisor, and had the entire crew falling over themselves to fix the problem. Instead, she decided to see how they would handle a regular passenger's completely legitimate complaint. This was about to become a defining moment for everyone involved. Carmen Rodriguez had been watching the situation develop from the corner of her eye. Something about the woman's calm demeanor in the face of such an obvious problem made her nervous. Most passengers would have been shouting by now, demanding supervisors and threatening social media campaigns. This woman just stood there observing as if she was studying the crew's response. Brenda Carmen said quietly, nodding toward row 26. "I think we might have a problem back there." Brenda followed Carmen's gaze and saw Amara standing beside the filthy seat, waiting patiently for attention. Her expression showed no concern whatsoever. In 18 years of flying, she'd developed an immunity to passenger complaints that bordered on contempt. "Let me guess," Brenda said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Princess over there doesn't like her seat assignment and wants us to move her to first class." Carmen winced at her colleague's tone. "Maybe we should at least take a look. The passenger seems reasonable." "They're all reasonable until they don't get what they want," Brenda replied. "Trust me, after 18 years I can spot the entitled ones from across the cabin. Watch and learn." As Brenda began walking toward row 26, James Taylor adjusted his phone camera angle to capture whatever was about to unfold. His instincts told him this interaction was going to be significant, though he had no idea just how significant it would become. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately reshape an entire industry's approach to customer service, but none of the players knew their roles yet. Brenda saw another annoying passenger to dismiss. Carmen saw a situation that made her uncomfortable. James saw content for his travel blog. Only Amara understood that she was about to conduct the most important employee evaluation of her career. The aircraft continued boarding around them, oblivious passengers settling into their seats, while the drama that would soon grip the nation's attention was about to begin in row 26. Before Brenda could reach Amara's row, a commotion erupted near the back of the aircraft that would soon overshadow even the filthy seat situation. Eleanor Henderson's voice cut through the cabin noise like a knife filled with the kind of desperate panic that makes everyone stop what they're doing. "Please, you have to help us," Eleanor was saying, her 78-year-old voice trembling with stress and exhaustion. "There's been some kind of mistake with our seats." Amara turned to see an elderly couple standing in the aisle near row 33, their boarding passes clutched in Eleanor's shaking hands. Robert Henderson, 84, and clearly confused by his surroundings, kept looking around the cabin with the lost expression of someone whose world had become suddenly unfamiliar. Eleanor held up their boarding passes to show Carmen Rodriguez, who had responded to the commotion. "Our seats are 26A and 33F. "How is that possible? We booked together 6 months ago. I specifically requested adjacent seats because of his condition." Robert's hands fluttered nervously at his sides, his eyes darting from face to face as he tried to process what was happening. The noise of the boarding process, the unfamiliar environment, and the separation from his wife were creating a perfect storm of anxiety for someone whose cognitive abilities had been steadily declining. "Sir, you need to sit down," said a passenger in 32C who was growing impatient with the delay. "You're blocking the aisle." "He can't just sit down anywhere," Eleanor replied, her voice rising. "He has dementia. I'm his caregiver. We cannot be separated on this flight." Carmen looked at the boarding passes, then at her tablet, then back at the passes. The computer system had indeed assigned the elderly couple to seats 7 rows apart, one near the window, and one in the middle of a different row entirely. "Ma'am, I see the issue," Carmen said, trying to sound helpful while clearly out of her depth. "But the flight is completely full. I'm not sure how we can fix this right now." "Then we need to fix it," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm not being difficult. This is a medical necessity." Robert gets confused and frightened when I'm not right beside him. He had an episode last month when we got separated in a grocery store for just 5 minutes. Robert Henderson had started to rock slightly back and forth, a self-soothing behavior that Eleanor recognized as a sign of mounting distress. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch immediately calming him, demonstrating the profound connection between caregiver and patient. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered to her husband of 56 years. "I'm going to fix this." Sofia Gutierrez, a 29-year-old nurse sitting in 25B, had been watching the situation develop with growing concern. She'd seen enough elderly patients with cognitive decline to recognize the signs of someone who was becoming overwhelmed by an environment they couldn't process. "Excuse me," Sophia said to Carmen. "I'm a registered nurse. This gentleman is clearly experiencing distress from the separation. This isn't just a preference. It's a genuine medical need." Carmen looked between Sophia, Eleanor, and Robert, feeling completely unprepared for a situation that required actual problem-solving rather than just enforcing rules. Her training had covered safety procedures and service protocols, but nothing about dealing with passengers with special medical needs. "I understand," Carmen said, though her voice suggested she really didn't. "But we can't just move other passengers around because what Eleanor interrupted her desperation, now turning to anger. "Because my husband's disability is inconvenient. Because keeping a dementia patient calm isn't worth the effort. James Taylor, still recording from his seat across the aisle, had shifted his phone to capture this new drama. Within minutes, he was providing live commentary for his followers. We've got a situation developing on Skyline Airways 847. Elderly dementia patient separated from his wife/caregiver. Crew seems completely unprepared to handle basic medical accommodation. The hashtag Skyline Shame had been born, though no one realized it yet. Brenda Martinez finally reached the scene, having heard enough of the commotion to understand that this was escalating beyond a simple seating dispute. She surveyed the situation with the cold efficiency of someone who'd handled thousands of passenger complaints and had developed an emotional callous against all of them. "What seems to be the problem here?" Brenda asked, though her tone suggested the problem was the passengers themselves. Eleanor explained the situation again, her voice growing more strained with each repetition. Robert was becoming increasingly agitated, his confusion manifesting in nervous hand gestures and worried glances around the cabin. "Ma'am," Brenda said with practiced patience, "that was really just disguised condescension. I understand this is frustrating, but the flight is full. We simply cannot accommodate special seating requests once boarding has begun." "This isn't a special request," Sophia interjected. "This is a reasonable accommodation under the Air Carrier Access Act. Airlines are required to make provisions for passengers with disabilities." Brenda's expression hardened. She didn't appreciate passengers quoting regulations at her, especially passengers who weren't even involved in the original complaint. "Miss, please stay out of this," Brenda said sharply. "This is between the crew and the ticketed passengers." "Actually," Sophia replied, standing up to her full height, "this is between human decency and airline policy, and right now decency is losing." The confrontation was attracting attention throughout the rear section of the aircraft. Passengers were turning in their seats, many pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a significant incident. The hashtag Skyline Shame was about to trend nationwide. Eleanor Henderson looked at her husband, who was now gripping the seatback in front of him so tightly his knuckles had gone white. 56 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the signs of an impending episode. Robert was retreating into himself, overwhelmed by the chaos and noise and the absence of his primary anchor in an increasingly confusing world. "Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking, "just look at him. Look at what this is doing to him." But Brenda's training in customer service had been replaced long ago by a defense mechanism that treated passenger emotion as manipulation. She'd heard every sob story, every dramatic plea, every heartbreaking explanation for why the rules should be bent. After 18 years, she'd convinced herself that being unmoved by passenger distress was professionalism rather than cruelty. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," Brenda said, "but the aircraft is full. Your husband will just have to manage for a few hours. I'm sure he'll be fine once we're in the air." The words hung in the cabin air like toxic gas. Several passengers gasped audibly. James Taylor's commentary became heated. "Did she just tell a dementia patient's wife that he'll have to manage? This is absolutely unacceptable." Carmen Rodriguez stood frozen, watching her supervisor dismiss a legitimate medical accommodation request with casual cruelty. This was her moment to choose between doing what was right and maintaining her job security. The career she'd worked so hard to build was suddenly at odds with basic human compassion. Robert Henderson began making a low humming sound, a coping mechanism Eleanor recognized as his response to overwhelming stress. She knew from experience that if his anxiety continued to escalate, he could become combative or try to leave the aircraft, creating an even more dangerous situation. "You don't understand," Eleanor said, tears now streaming down her face. "This isn't about preference or comfort. This is about preventing a medical emergency." Amara Brooks had been watching the entire interaction from her position beside the filthy seat in row 26. She'd witnessed many failures of corporate culture in her career, but this was something different. This was a complete breakdown of the values that should define any service organization: empathy, problem-solving, and basic human decency. She was watching her airline fail not just a customer service test, but a fundamental test of humanity. The crisis was about to deepen in ways none of them could imagine. Amara had seen enough. The Henderson situation was escalating toward a medical emergency. Her own seat was a biohazard that violated basic health standards, and her flight crew was demonstrating levels of indifference that would have been shocking in any service industry, let alone commercial aviation. She approached the cluster of people around row 33 with the calm determination of an executive who'd spent decades solving complex problems under pressure. Her voice, when she spoke, carried an authority that cut through the chaos like a tuning fork finding its frequency. "Excuse me," Amara said, addressing Brenda Martinez directly. "I think there might be a solution here that works for everyone." Brenda turned toward this new voice with barely concealed annoyance. Another passenger injecting themselves into a situation that was already complicated enough. Her day was going from bad to worse, and the last thing she needed was more amateur problem solvers offering suggestions. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Brenda said dismissively. "We have the situation under control." "Actually, you don't," Amara replied calmly. "What you have is a medical accommodation issue that requires immediate attention and a passenger in 26C whose seat is unsanitary and unsafe for human occupancy." Brenda's eyebrows shot up. The audacity of this woman was breathtaking. Here she was dressed like she was going to a college campus gym, presuming to tell an 18-year veteran flight attendant how to handle passenger issues. Carmen Rodriguez watched the interaction with growing unease. Something about this new passenger felt different. Her posture, her vocabulary, the way she spoke with quiet confidence rather than emotional demand. Carmen's instincts were telling her to pay attention. "Your seat?" Brenda asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Let me guess, you don't like your assignment either." "I don't like sitting in a biohazard," Amara replied evenly. "The seat hasn't been cleaned in days, possibly weeks. There's rotting food in the seat back pocket, and stains on every surface. It's a health violation." James Taylor, who had been recording everything from his position across the aisle, immediately trained his camera on Amara. There was something compelling about her composed response to what was clearly outrageous treatment. His followers were already engaging heavily with his live stream, the viewer count climbing rapidly. And regarding Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, Amara continued. "The solution is straightforward. Airlines are legally required to provide reasonable accommodations for passengers with disabilities. Seating a dementia patient next to his caregiver isn't just good customer service, it's federal law." Brenda's face flushed red. The last thing she needed was some random passenger lecturing her about federal law while her supervisors might be watching, while other passengers were recording, and while her authority was being challenged in front of the entire cabin. That's when it happened. Brenda Martinez, 18-year veteran of Skyline Airways, looked at this woman in the gray hoodie who had the nerve to tell her how to do her job, and she laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle. This was a full-throated, theatrical laugh that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. It was the sound of contempt made audible, dismissal transformed into mockery, cruelty given voice. The laugh lasted maybe 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds would eventually cost Skyline Airways millions of dollars and reshape the entire airline industry's approach to customer service. James Taylor's phone captured every note of it. The sound was so shocking, so inappropriate that passengers throughout the rear section turned to stare. Several pulled out their own phones, sensing that something significant was happening. "Federal law," Brenda said, still chuckling. "Lady, this is an airplane, not a hospital. If you don't like the accommodations, maybe you should have bought a first-class ticket instead of trying to get special treatment after the fact." The silence that followed was deafening. Even passengers who had been absorbed in their books or phones were now watching, sensing the gravity of what had just occurred. Eleanor Henderson's mouth fell open in shock. Sofia Gutierrez shook her head in disbelief. Carmen Rodriguez felt her stomach drop as she realized her supervisor had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Amara Brooks, CEO of Skyline Airways, stood perfectly still in the aisle of her own aircraft processing what had just happened. She'd been laughed at, mocked, dismissed with theatrical cruelty while making reasonable requests about basic health and safety standards and federal disability law. "I see," Amara said quietly, her voice so calm it was almost a whisper. "Thank you for clarifying your position." James Taylor's live stream had exploded with comments. Viewer after viewer was expressing outrage, sharing the stream, tagging disability advocacy groups and news outlets. The phrase, "flight attendant laughs at passenger," was already being typed into thousands of posts across multiple social media platforms. Within minutes, the hashtag #SkylineShame would be trending nationally. But in that moment, in the stale air of the aircraft cabin surrounded by passengers who were becoming witnesses to something unprecedented, Amara made a decision that would change everything. She didn't reveal her identity. She didn't demand to speak to a supervisor. She didn't raise her voice or make threats. Instead, she simply said, "I'll remember this conversation," and walked back to her seat. Brenda watched her go with satisfaction, completely unaware that she'd just laughed at the person who could end her career with a single phone call. Carmen felt sick to her stomach knowing that something irreversible had just happened, but unable to do anything about it. Eleanor Henderson continued trying to comfort her increasingly agitated husband, while Sofia Gutierrez pulled out her own phone to document what she'd witnessed. The laugh that would eventually be heard around the world had been recorded from multiple angles, shared across multiple platforms, and tagged with multiple hashtags. Brenda Martinez had just committed career suicide, but she wouldn't know it for several more hours. The revolution had begun. Amara settled into the aisle seat of row 24, having quietly negotiated a trade with a sympathetic passenger who'd witnessed the entire exchange and offered his cleaner seat without being asked. The gesture restored a tiny bit of her faith in humanity, though it did nothing to address the larger crisis she'd just witnessed. She pulled out her phone and composed a text message that looked casual but would set in motion a chain of events that would reshape her airline. "David, it's worse than we thought. Much worse. Are you monitoring social?" The response came back within 30 seconds. "Watching everything in real time. James Taylor's stream has 50K live viewers and climbing. Skyline. Shame trending in 6 markets. Do you want me to intervene?" "Not yet. Let it develop naturally. I need the full picture. David Martinez." Her secretly appointed crisis management specialist had been monitoring Skyline Airways' digital presence from his office in the corporate headquarters building. What he was watching unfold on social media was an airline executive's nightmare authentic, unfiltered documentation of customer service failure spreading across the internet at viral speed. Amara had hired David 3 weeks ago as part of her pre-announcement preparation. His background in crisis communications and airline operations made him uniquely qualified to help navigate the challenges of taking over a company with serious cultural problems. But neither of them had anticipated witnessing those problems this dramatically on her very first flight. Captain Luis Rodriguez had been conducting his pre-flight checks in the cockpit insulated from the cabin chaos by training protocol and soundproof doors. At 52, he'd been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years and prided himself on maintaining professional standards regardless of what was happening behind him. His job was to get passengers safely from point A to point B. Everything else was someone else's responsibility. But even Captain Rodriguez couldn't ignore the unprecedented number of flight attendant calls coming through his communication system. First Officer Ashley White, 31, and relatively new to commercial aviation, had been monitoring the cabin audio feeds and was clearly disturbed by what she was hearing. Captain Ashley said carefully. "I think we might have a situation developing in the passenger cabin. The crew seems to be dealing with multiple complaints, and I'm picking up some unusual chatter from the passengers." Captain Rodriguez frowned. In 2 decades of flying, he'd learned that passenger complaints usually fell into predictable categories: seat assignments, meal preferences, baggage issues, or minor comfort concerns. Crews were trained to handle these routine problems without involving flight operations. "What kind of situation?" he asked. "It's hard to tell exactly, but there seems to be some kind of medical accommodation issue with an elderly passenger, plus multiple complaints about cabin cleanliness. And..." Ashley hesitated, unsure how to phrase what she'd overheard. "I think there might be some passenger relations issues with the crew." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Carmen Rodriguez was experiencing the worst shift of her young career. The Henderson situation remained unresolved, with Robert becoming increasingly agitated as boarding continued around him. Eleanor had managed to get him seated in 33F, but he kept looking around frantically for his wife, who was sitting 7 rows away with no clear line of sight. Carmen approached Brenda, who was updating passenger counts on her tablet with apparent indifference to the ongoing crisis. Brenda Carmen said quietly, "Shouldn't we try to do something about the elderly couple? He's getting more upset, and his wife looks like she's about to have a breakdown." Brenda didn't look up from her screen. "The seats are assigned by the computer. We can't just move people around because family members want to sit together. If we make exceptions for one passenger, we'll have everyone demanding special treatment. But this isn't about preference," Carmen insisted. "The man has dementia. His wife says he needs her nearby for medical reasons." "His wife says a lot of things," Brenda replied dismissively. "Passengers always exaggerate to get what they want. Trust me, after 18 years, I've heard every sob story in the book." Carmen felt her stomach twist. 3 months into her flight attendant career, she was discovering that experience didn't always translate to wisdom. Sometimes it just meant 18 years of accumulated cynicism and hardened indifference to human suffering. James Taylor was providing continuous commentary to his growing online audience, his travel blog transforming into citizen journalism in real time. "We're about 30 minutes into boarding, and the situation has somehow gotten worse. The elderly dementia patient is clearly in distress. His wife is crying, and the flight crew seems completely indifferent to what's obviously a medical emergency in the making." His viewer count had climbed to over 75,000, with comments pouring in from around the world. Disability advocates were sharing the stream, airline industry. Insiders were weighing in with technical insights, and mainstream media accounts were beginning to take notice. Disability Rights now tweeted, "This is exactly the kind of discrimination the Air Carrier Access Act was designed to prevent. Skyline. Air needs to explain why they're ignoring federal law." Aviation. Today replied, "Unacceptable. This crew needs immediate retraining on ADA compliance. The optics alone are devastating." Breaking News picked up the story. Live elderly dementia patient separated from caregiver wife on Skyline Air flight. Crew refuses accommodation. Video has 100K plus views and climbing. Sofia Gutierrez had moved to an empty middle seat in row 32, positioning herself closer to Robert Henderson so she could monitor his condition. As a registered nurse, she recognized the signs of someone whose cognitive processing was being overwhelmed by environmental stressors. "Mr. Henderson," she said gently. "My name is Sophia. I'm a nurse. How are you feeling right now?" Robert's eyes focused on her with visible relief. A calm, professional voice in the chaos was exactly what his confused mind needed. Where's Eleanor? I don't understand where she went." "She's right here on the airplane with you," Sophia assured him. "She just had to sit in a different row because of a computer mistake. But she's safe, and she's watching out for you." Sophia pulled out her phone and began documenting Robert's symptoms, creating a medical record that would later become crucial evidence. Rapid breathing disorientation, repetitive movements, verbal expressions of confusion and distress. Any healthcare professional would recognize these as signs of someone experiencing cognitive overload that could escalate into a full medical emergency. She typed a quick message to her nursing colleagues. Watching airline crew ignore obvious medical accommodation needs for dementia patient. This is how people get hurt. Skyline Air should be ashamed. Skyline shame disability rights. Amara continued her documentation from row 24, taking detailed notes on every aspect of the crisis unfolding around her. Names times exact quotes, policy violations, federal law infractions. As CEO, she would need comprehensive evidence to support the comprehensive changes she was already planning, but she was also documenting something more troubling than poor customer service. She was watching a culture of indifference that had clearly been developing for years, possibly decades. This wasn't about inadequate training or bad policies. This was about fundamental values that had gone wrong at the institutional level. Her phone buzzed with another message from David CNN, wants a statement. Stock down 4% in after-hours trading. Board chair is asking questions. How long do you want this to continue? Amara looked around the cabin at Eleanor Henderson's tear-stained face, at Robert's obvious distress, at Sophia's professional concern, at James's righteous documentation, at Carmen's growing discomfort with her supervisor's behavior, at Brenda's complete indifference to the crisis she'd created. Let it continue, she typed back. I need to see how deep this goes. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure. We're currently on schedule for an on-time departure. The announcement felt surreal given the chaos in the passenger cabin. Amara realized that the flight operations team had no idea what was happening behind the cockpit door, which meant this crisis was being handled entirely by the cabin crew, who had already demonstrated their inability to handle it appropriately. 23 minutes until takeoff. The Henderson family crisis was about to become a national story. Brenda Martinez was about to become the face of airline industry indifference, and Amara Brooks was about to receive the most expensive education in corporate culture failure ever recorded on social media. The plane began pulling back from the gate while the revolution in customer service standards gathered momentum in the passenger cabin and across the internet. The moment James Taylor's stream crossed 100,000 viewers, everything changed. What had started as a travel blog documenting poor airline service had evolved into something far more significant, a real-time case study in corporate culture failure being witnessed by a global audience. The comments section had become a digital protest rally. Viewers were sharing personal stories of airline discrimination, tagging disability advocacy organizations, and demanding immediate action from Skyline Airways. The hashtag #SkylineShame wasn't just trending. It was exploding across every major social media platform simultaneously. Disability Justice shared the stream with their 2.3 million followers, happening now. Skyline. Aircrew laughs at passenger advocating for elderly dementia patient. This is why we fight for dignity in travel. Disability Rights, Skyline. Shame Senator Martinez, chair of the Transportation Committee, posted, watching this Skyline Air situation with deep concern. Airlines receiving federal support must comply with federal disability law. Period. Accountability matters. Good morning. USA's verified account tagged the story. Breaking overnight. Airline crew faces backlash after viral video shows apparent discrimination against elderly passenger with dementia. Full coverage at 6 a.m. David Martinez was juggling 12 different crisis management protocols from his office while monitoring the social media explosion in real time. His screens showed trending data that would have been impressive for a planned marketing campaign, but was absolutely catastrophic for an unplanned crisis. Regional trends. Skyline. Shame is number 1 in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, and Dallas. He reported to Amara via encrypted text. National trend velocity suggests we'll hit 500K mentions within the hour. Legal is asking if we should issue a preliminary statement. Not yet, Amara replied from her seat. I need to see how the crew responds as this develops. This is a test of our crisis management at the operational level. But Carmen Rodriguez was beginning to realize that they were failing that test spectacularly. Her phone had been buzzing with notifications as friends and family members began seeing the viral videos and recognizing her uniform, her face, her presence in the background of what was becoming a national news story. Her sister Maria had texted Carmen. Is that you on the airplane video? The one where the flight attendant is laughing at the passenger? This is all over my Facebook feed. People are furious. Carmen's stomach dropped. She pulled up Instagram and searched for Skyline Shame, immediately finding dozens of posts featuring screenshots and video clips from James's stream. Her face was clearly visible in several of them, standing next to Brenda as the crisis unfolded. The comments were brutal. Both flight attendants should be fired immediately. Disgusting behavior. The younger one looks uncomfortable but doesn't speak up. Complicity is still guilt. How does Skyline Air hire people who laugh at disability accommodation requests? Name and shame both of these women. They chose cruelty. Carmen felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized that her career, her reputation, and her future were being destroyed in real time by an audience of hundreds of thousands of strangers who had watched her fail to stand up for what was right. Sofia Gutierrez had become an unofficial medical advocate for Robert Henderson, positioning herself where she could monitor his condition while providing real-time updates to her own social media followers. As a healthcare professional with 15,000 followers across nursing and medical communities, her posts were being shared rapidly among people who understood the medical implications of what they were witnessing. Update patient, showing classic signs of cognitive overload. Increased agitation, repetitive behaviors, searching for primary caregiver. This is exactly how medical emergencies develop in vulnerable populations. Skyline. Aircrew has zero medical training, apparently. Her posts were being shared by medical professionals around the country, adding clinical credibility to what could have been dismissed as travel complaints. Nurses, doctors, therapists, and caregivers were weighing in with technical explanations of why separating a dementia patient from their caregiver wasn't just poor customer service. It was medically dangerous. Dr. Rebecca Stanford, a geriatric psychiatrist with 100,000 Twitter followers, posted a thread that would eventually be shared 50,000 times. Thread. What you're seeing on Skyline Shame isn't just bad customer service. It's a medical accommodation failure that could result in serious injury. 1 of 12 dementia patients rely on familiar caregivers for cognitive anchoring. Separation in stressful environments can trigger fight-or-flight responses. 2 of 12. The crew's refusal to provide reasonable accommodation violates the Air Carrier Access Act and puts this passenger at genuine risk. 3 of 12. Meanwhile, Brenda Martinez remained completely oblivious to the digital wildfire she'd ignited. She was updating meal service counts and reviewing safety briefing notes, occasionally glancing toward the Henderson situation with mild annoyance, but no recognition of its severity. Her 18 years of experience had taught her that passenger complaints were temporary inconveniences that would be forgotten once the flight was over. She had no concept of how social media had transformed customer service accountability, no understanding that her dismissive laugh was being watched by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Eleanor Henderson had managed to move herself to an empty seat closer to her husband despite Brenda's earlier insistence that such moves were impossible. Other passengers, horrified by what they'd witnessed, had quietly rearranged themselves to make space for the elderly couple to sit together. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered to the businessman who had given up his aisle seat. "Thank you so much." "Ma'am," the passenger replied, "what happened to you folks was wrong, completely wrong. And everybody saw it." He wasn't exaggerating. The passenger uprising was happening both digitally and physically. People throughout the cabin were documenting the situation, sharing their own footage, and expressing their disgust with the crew's behavior in increasingly public ways. Captain Rodriguez finally received word of the social media crisis when ground operations contacted the cockpit with an unprecedented message. "Captain, we're getting calls from media outlets about your flight. Something about passenger service issues. Corporate wants to know if you need ground support." For the first time, Captain Rodriguez realized that whatever was happening in his cabin had escalated far beyond normal passenger relations. He instructed First Officer White to contact the lead flight attendant for a status report. When Carmen's phone rang with the cockpit's call, she was still staring at the devastating comments about her performance. Her hands shook as she answered. "Carmen, this is Ashley from the flight deck. We're getting reports of some kind of passenger situation. Can you give us a status update?" Carmen looked around the cabin at Robert Henderson's obvious distress, at Eleanor's tears, at Sophia's medical monitoring, at James Taylor's ongoing live stream, at the dozens of other passengers recording everything with their phones, at Brenda's continued indifference to the crisis she'd created. Carmen started, then stopped. How could she explain that they'd created a national incident by laughing at disability accommodation requests? How could she tell the flight deck that their crew had violated federal law on camera? How could she admit that she'd been complicit in humiliating an elderly couple who needed help? Ma'am, Ashley prompted. "Is everything under control back there?" Carmen looked at her phone, still displaying the brutal comments from strangers who had watched her fail to do the right thing. She thought about her training, which had emphasized customer service and passenger safety. She thought about her values, which included compassion and advocacy for vulnerable people. "No," Carmen said quietly. "Everything is not under control." The admission would mark the beginning of her redemption, but it came too late to prevent the complete destruction of Skyline Airways' reputation that was already spreading across the internet like wildfire. By the time the aircraft reached cruising altitude Skyline, shame would be the top trending topic in the United States, with over 1 million mentions and coverage from every major news outlet in the country. Brenda Martinez's laugh would be heard around the world. Michael Thompson had been watching the Henderson situation develop from his first-class seat with growing irritation. At 48, he'd built a successful consulting business by maintaining tight schedules and expecting others to do the same. The drama unfolding in Coach was exactly the kind of inefficiency that drove him to pay premium prices for premium service. When Captain Rodriguez announced a 15-minute departure delay for passenger services coordination, Michael decided he'd had enough of watching the crew accommodate what he saw as unreasonable demands from difficult passengers. He pressed his call button. Carmen Rodriguez appeared at his seat within 30 seconds. Her face still flushed from the stress of managing multiple crises, while knowing that hundreds of thousands of people were watching her performance online. "Yes, Mr. Thompson," Carmen said, forcing a smile despite feeling like her world was falling apart. "How can I help you?" Michael gestured toward the rear of the aircraft, where Eleanor Henderson was finally sitting next to her husband, having traded seats with 3 different passengers who'd been appalled by the crew's initial refusal to help. "What's the holdup back there?" Michael demanded. "I've got a meeting in San Francisco that I cannot miss. How long are we going to be delayed because someone doesn't like their seat assignment?" Carmen felt her stomach drop further. She was being squeezed between passengers like Michael, who viewed the Henderson situation as an inconvenience, passengers throughout the cabin who were furious with the crew's handling of the situation, social media users who were calling for her termination, and her own supervisor who continued to insist that they'd done nothing wrong. "Sir, we're just working through some passenger accommodation issues," Carmen said carefully. "We should be departing momentarily." "Accommodation issues?" Michael's voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to having his concerns prioritized. "Look, I understand that people want special treatment, but at some point the airline needs to enforce its policies. You can't just let passengers manipulate you with sob stories." His words were loud enough to be heard several rows away, including by James Taylor, who was still streaming live to an audience that had grown to over 200,000 viewers. The comments section exploded with outrage at Michael's characterization of a medical accommodation as manipulation. Did he just call a dementia patient's medical needs a sob story? One viewer wrote. This is exactly the toxic attitude that creates discrimination, posted another. Name and shame this businessman, too. He's part of the problem. Sophia Gutierrez, who was still monitoring Robert Henderson's condition, had heard Michael's comment and felt her professional composure crack. As a nurse, she'd spent years advocating for patients whose medical needs were dismissed or minimized by people who didn't understand the realities of cognitive decline. "Excuse me," Sophia said, turning in her seat to address Michael directly. "That sob story you're referring to is a federal law requiring reasonable accommodation for passengers with disabilities. Maybe your meeting isn't more important than basic human decency." Michael's face reddened. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged by random passengers, especially not while the entire interaction was being recorded and broadcast live. "Miss, I don't know who you think you are," Michael said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "But I pay first-class prices to avoid exactly this kind of drama. If these people have special needs, maybe they should fly on medical transport instead of disrupting commercial flights." The cabin went dead silent. Even passengers who had been absorbed in their phones or books were now staring at Michael with undisguised disgust. James Taylor's viewer count spiked as people shared the stream with increasingly inflammatory comments about the businessman's attitude. Eleanor Henderson, who had finally gotten her husband settled and was hoping the crisis was over, heard every word of Michael's dismissive comments about her 56-year marriage and her husband's medical condition. The cruelty of it hit her like a physical blow. "Drama," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with exhaustion and pain. "My husband served this country in Vietnam. He worked 40 years as a high school principal. He raised 3 children and has 7 grandchildren who adore him. He's losing his memory, not his humanity. And we have every right to fly safely and with dignity." Her words carried the weight of decades of love, sacrifice, and devotion. The contrast between Eleanor's grace under pressure and Michael's entitled indifference was so stark that even passengers who hadn't been following the situation were now recording and sharing their own posts. Brenda Martinez chose this moment to make the situation exponentially worse. She had been watching the interactions between passengers with growing annoyance, feeling like her authority was being undermined by people who didn't understand airline operations. In her 18 years of experience, she'd learned that passengers who challenged crew authority needed to be shut down quickly and decisively. "Folks," Brenda announced loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear, "we need everyone to take their assigned seats so we can complete our departure preparations. The discussion time is over." Her tone was condescending and final, as if the Hendersons' medical accommodation request and the passenger advocacy were merely discussions that could be terminated at her discretion. Sophia stood up. "Ma'am, this isn't a discussion. This is a federal law compliance issue. The Air Carrier Access Act requires airlines to provide reasonable accommodations for passengers with disabilities. Refusing to seat a dementia patient next to his caregiver violates that law." Brenda's face flushed with anger. She'd been challenged enough for one flight, and she wasn't about to let a random passenger lecture her about regulations. "Miss, unless you're an airline employee or a federal inspector, I don't need you to tell me how to do my job." "Actually," Sophia replied, pulling out her nursing license and holding it up, "I'm a registered nurse, and I'm telling you that what I'm witnessing is medical discrimination. This man is showing signs of cognitive distress that could escalate into a medical emergency if his anxiety continues to increase." Carmen Rodriguez watched this exchange with growing horror. Sophia was absolutely correct about the medical issues, the federal law, and the crew's obligations. But Carmen could also see that Brenda was about to escalate the situation in ways that would make everything worse. She was right. "You know what Brenda said?" Her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm getting really tired of passengers who think they know how to run an airline better than the professionals. If you folks don't like our service, maybe you should book your next flight with someone else." The audacity of her statement was breathtaking. James Taylor's live audience was approaching 300,000 viewers, with major news outlets now sharing the stream. Brenda had just suggested that passengers who expected basic disability accommodations should find another airline, completely unaware that she was creating the most damaging public relations crisis in her airline's history. Michael Thompson, emboldened by what he saw as crew support for his position, decided to add his voice to Brenda's dismissal of passenger concerns. Finally, he said loudly, "Someone with common sense. These people are holding up the entire flight with their demands. If they can't handle commercial flying, they shouldn't buy tickets." The cruelty was so casual, so thoughtless, that several passengers gasped audibly. Eleanor Henderson began crying again, overwhelmed by the public humiliation of having her husband's medical condition mocked by strangers. But Robert Henderson, whose confusion had been mounting throughout the crisis, suddenly stood up. "Where am I?" he said loudly, his voice filled with panic. "Eleanor. Eleanor, where are we? I want to go home." Sophia immediately recognized the signs of a full cognitive breakdown. Robert's anxiety had escalated beyond his ability to process his environment, and he was entering fight-or-flight mode. In a confined space like an aircraft cabin, this could quickly become dangerous for everyone involved. "Mr. Henderson," Sophia said calmly, moving toward him with professional efficiency. "You're safe. You're with Eleanor on an airplane going to see your daughter. Everything is okay." But Robert was beyond reassurance. The combination of stress, unfamiliar surroundings, separation anxiety, and the hostile environment created by the crew and Michael Thompson had pushed him into the kind of episode that Eleanor had been trying to prevent. "I don't understand," Robert said, his voice rising. "I don't understand what's happening. I want to leave. I want to leave right now." Eleanor reached for her husband's hand. "Sweetheart, it's okay. We're together now. Remember, we're flying to see Sarah and the grandchildren." James Taylor's commentary became urgent. "We now have what appears to be a medical emergency developing. The elderly dementia patient is having some kind of episode, which is exactly what his wife was trying to prevent when she asked for accommodation an hour ago." The hashtag Skyline Shame exploded across social media as viewers shared the stream with increasingly angry commentary about the crew's role in creating a medical crisis through their refusal to provide basic accommodation. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. Flight attendants to the flight deck immediately. But it was too late. The damage was done. Brenda Martinez's dismissive attitude, Michael Thompson's cruel comments, and the crew's failure to handle a routine accommodation request had created exactly the kind of in-flight medical emergency that federal disability laws were designed to prevent. Carmen Rodriguez finally found her voice and her courage. "Brenda," she said firmly, "we need to call for medical assistance, and we need to acknowledge that we caused this by refusing reasonable accommodation." It was the first time all day that anyone from the crew had accepted responsibility for their failures. But acknowledging the problem was just the beginning of fixing it. The revolution in airline customer service standards was about to reach a tipping point that would reshape the entire industry. Amara Brooks had been watching the escalating crisis with the analytical eye of an executive and the growing concern of a human being. What had started as a routine assessment of customer service had become a real-time case study in institutional failure at every level. But Robert Henderson's medical episode marked the moment when documentation needed to shift to intervention. She stood up from her seat and approached the situation with the quiet authority that had characterized her entire career. Her movement was subtle but purposeful, and several passengers who had been watching her throughout the flight noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. "Excuse me," Amara said to Sophia, who was still attempting to calm Robert Henderson. "I'm going to make a phone call that might help resolve this situation." Sophia looked up, recognizing something in Amara's tone that suggested this wasn't just another passenger offering advice. "Okay," she said simply, trusting her instincts about this woman who had remained remarkably composed throughout the entire crisis. Amara moved to the rear galley area and placed a call to David Martinez. But this time, instead of texting discreet updates, she spoke aloud in a voice that carried clearly through the cabin. "David, this is Amara. We have a medical emergency developing on Flight 847 that was entirely preventable. I need you to contact Dr. Patricia Williams at the Disability Advocacy Center and get her on a conference call with our legal team immediately." Several passengers turned to stare. The woman in the gray hoodie, who had been quietly documenting everything, was suddenly making executive decisions and referencing legal teams and disability advocates by name. Also, Amara continued contact the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Office. "We have multiple violations of the Air Carrier Access Act that have been documented by hundreds of thousands of witnesses. This is going to require immediate federal notification." James Taylor, who had been streaming continuously, immediately focused his camera on Amara. His audience was now over 400,000 viewers, and the comments were exploding with speculation about who this woman was and why she was speaking with such authority. "Who is this passenger?" one viewer wrote. "She's talking like she runs the company. Wait, is she some kind of airline executive?" posted another. "She knows way too much about airline law and corporate structure to be a regular passenger." Brenda Martinez, who was still dealing with Robert Henderson's episode and the growing chaos in the cabin, heard Amara's phone conversation and felt a chill of recognition. Something about the woman's language, her knowledge of airline regulations, her casual reference to legal teams and federal agencies was triggering alarm bells. "Ma'am," Brenda said, approaching Amara in the galley, "I'm going to need you to return to your seat and end your phone call. We're dealing with an in-flight emergency." Amara looked at Brenda with an expression that was calm but completely uncompromising. "Ms. Martinez, the emergency you're dealing with was created by your crew's refusal to provide legally required accommodation. I'm working to resolve it at the appropriate level." The use of her name without introduction, combined with Amara's obvious knowledge of airline regulations and corporate procedures, made Brenda's stomach drop. She was beginning to suspect that this passenger wasn't just another traveler with opinions about customer service. Carmen Rodriguez, who had been listening to Amara's phone conversation while helping Sophia with Robert Henderson, felt her panic increase. The woman, who had been calm and professional throughout the crisis, was clearly someone with significant authority and airline industry knowledge. Brenda Carmen whispered urgently, "I think we might have a serious problem. That passenger knows too much about airline operations. What if she's from corporate?" "Don't be ridiculous," Brenda replied, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Corporate employees don't fly coach in hoodies. She's probably just some lawyer looking to create a lawsuit." But Amara's next phone call removed any doubt about her authority and knowledge. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, having obtained the cockpit number from David Martinez, "this is Amara Brooks. I need to speak with you immediately about the medical emergency in your cabin." Captain Rodriguez, who had been trying to get updates from his flight attendants, was startled to receive a direct call from a passenger who knew his name and spoke with unmistakable executive authority. "Ma'am, I'm not sure who you are," Captain Rodriguez said carefully, "but passengers aren't authorized to contact the flight deck directly." "Captain, I'm the newly appointed CEO of Skyline Airways," Amara said clearly enough for everyone in the rear galley to hear. "I've been conducting an undercover assessment of our operations, and what I've witnessed today represents the most comprehensive failure of company values I've seen in 20 years of airline industry experience." The silence that followed was absolute. Brenda Martinez felt the blood drain from her face. Carmen Rodriguez grabbed the galley counter for support. Michael Thompson, who had been eavesdropping from his first-class seat, went pale with the realization that he'd been insulting elderly passengers in front of his airline's CEO. James Taylor's live stream exploded with activity. The revelation that a major airline's CEO had been disguised as a regular passenger witnessing and documenting discrimination in real time was unprecedented in aviation history. Breaking woman on viral Skyline Airways. "Flight reveals she's the airline's CEO," he announced to his audience. This is absolutely incredible. She's been documenting everything while the crew treated her and other passengers terribly. Captain Rodriguez's voice came back through the phone, professional but clearly shaken. "Ma'am, we had no idea. What are your instructions?" "My immediate instruction is to ensure that Mr. and Mrs. Henderson receive proper medical attention and accommodation. My secondary instruction is to have ground operations standing by when we land. We're going to be dealing with significant media attention and federal investigation." Amara turned to face Brenda Martinez, who was standing frozen in the galley like a deer caught in headlights. 18 years of dismissing passenger complaints with impunity had not prepared her for the moment when one of those passengers turned out to be the person who could end her career. "Ms. Martinez," Amara said quietly, "do you have anything you'd like to say about your handling of the Henderson situation? Or about your response to my initial complaint about seat sanitation? Or about your decision to laugh at federal disability law requirements?" Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it. No words came. For the first time in her adult life, she was completely speechless. Carmen Rodriguez, whose world had been collapsing for the past hour as she watched her reputation destroyed on social media, suddenly found the courage that had abandoned her earlier. "Ms. Brooks," Carmen said, stepping forward, "I want to apologize. For everything. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I didn't speak up. I was afraid of challenging Brenda's authority, afraid of losing my job, afraid of making waves. But watching what happened to the Hendersons, watching you get dismissed and mocked, watching all of this unfold, I should have done better. I should have been better." Her words were captured by James Taylor's stream and would later be seen as the moment when individual accountability began to emerge from institutional failure. Carmen's admission of responsibility, while too late to prevent the crisis, marked the beginning of her path toward redemption. Sofia Gutierrez, who had finally gotten Robert Henderson calmed down with Eleanor's help, looked up at Amara with new understanding. "You're the CEO," Sofia said. "You've been watching all of this happen to your own customers on your own airline." "I have," Amara replied, "and what I've seen has been unacceptable. But what I've also seen is passengers like you stepping up to provide care and advocacy when our crew failed to do so. That gives me hope for the changes we're about to make." Eleanor Henderson, exhausted but grateful that her husband was finally calm, approached Amara with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," Eleanor said simply. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but thank you for caring enough to see what we went through." Michael Thompson, realizing that his dismissive comments about elderly passengers had been made directly to the airline's CEO, attempted to approach Amara to explain himself. She held up a hand to stop him. "Mr. Thompson," Amara said, "I heard everything you said about passengers with medical needs being drama and manipulation. I want you to know that your attitude represents exactly the kind of thinking we're going to eliminate from this industry." The power dynamics in the cabin had completely reversed. The crew members who had been dismissing passenger concerns with impunity were now facing the person who could end their careers. The businessman who had mocked elderly passengers was confronting the consequences of his casual cruelty. The passengers who had advocated for dignity and compassion were being validated at the highest corporate level. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into San Francisco. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing." But everyone in the cabin knew that this landing would be unlike any other in aviation history. The viral videos had created a national conversation about airline customer service disability rights and corporate accountability. Federal investigators would be waiting. Media crews would be gathered. The entire airline industry would be watching to see how Skyline Airways responded to the most documented customer service failure in commercial aviation history. Amara returned to her seat, but not before addressing the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the aircraft, "I want to apologize for what you've witnessed today, As the CEO of Skyline Airways, I take full responsibility for the failures in service accommodation and basic human decency that have occurred on this flight. What happened to the Henderson family, what happened to every passenger who was dismissed or mocked or ignored is unacceptable and will not be tolerated going forward. The announcement was met with applause that started slowly but built to a standing ovation. Passengers who had been horrified by their airline experience were now witnessing unprecedented accountability from the top of the corporate structure. The crew members responsible for today's failures will be held accountable, Amara continued. But more importantly, we will be implementing comprehensive changes to ensure that every passenger is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. James Taylor's stream had reached over 600,000 viewers, with major news networks now providing live coverage of the flight's approach to San Francisco. Skyline. Shame had evolved into Skyline accountability as viewers watched a CEO take personal responsibility for institutional failure in real time. As the aircraft descended toward what would become the most documented airline landing in history, everyone on board knew that they had witnessed something unprecedented. The moment when corporate accountability met viral social media, when individual courage confronted institutional indifference, and when the demand for dignity transformed an entire industry. The revolution was about to land. San Francisco International Airport had never experienced anything like the media circus that was gathering at Gate B-27. News crews from every major network were setting up equipment. Disability rights advocates were organizing press statements, and social media influencers were streaming live coverage of the approaching aircraft that had become the center of a national conversation about airline accountability. David Martinez coordinated the ground response from the Skyline Airways Crisis Management Center, a room that had been activated only 3 times in the company's history, but was now operating at full capacity. Multiple screens displayed real-time social media analytics, news coverage, stock price fluctuations, and federal agency communications. Legal confirms that the Department of Transportation has opened a formal investigation. David reported to Amara via encrypted communication. Disability rights organizations are demanding immediate policy changes. The stock has recovered slightly on news of your direct intervention, but we're still facing potential regulatory sanctions. Understood, Amara replied. Have you arranged for medical personnel to meet the Henderson family? Paramedics are standing by along with a social worker who specializes in dementia care. We've also arranged for a private area where they can decompress away from the media attention. As Flight 847 touched down at SFO, passengers began powering on their phones to discover that they'd been part of the most viral airline story in recent memory. Text messages poured in from friends and family members who had been watching the live streams. Social media notifications exploded across devices throughout the cabin. Carmen Rodriguez stared at her phone in horror as she discovered that her face and name had been identified by online investigators and shared across multiple platforms. The comments ranged from calls for her termination to death threats from people who had watched her stand silently while her supervisor mocked disability accommodation requests. Carmen Rodriguez Skyline. Air flight attendant watched elderly dementia patient get separated from caregiver and said, "Nothing. Fire her immediately. This woman is complicit in elder abuse. She should never work in customer service again." At least the younger flight attendant looked uncomfortable. The older one is pure evil. Carmen felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that her 3-month career in aviation was over before it had truly begun. But worse than losing her job was the knowledge that she had failed to stand up for people who needed her help when it mattered most. Brenda Martinez, meanwhile, was experiencing the complete destruction of an 18-year career in real time. Her name, face, and employment history had been researched and shared by thousands of online activists who were demanding accountability for her behavior. Her personal Facebook page, which she had forgotten to make private, was being flooded with screenshots and video clips of her dismissive laugh, her refusal to accommodate the Henderson family, and her casual cruelty toward passengers who had asked for basic service standards. Former passengers were sharing their own stories of negative interactions with Brenda dating back years, creating a comprehensive record of behavior patterns that painted a picture of someone who had been mistreating customers for most of her career. Michael Thompson was discovering that his corporate consulting business was facing a crisis of its own. His LinkedIn profile had been identified and shared across professional networks, with potential clients expressing concern about working with someone who had publicly mocked elderly passengers with medical needs. His phone was buzzing with cancellation calls from clients who had seen the viral videos and decided they couldn't afford to be associated with someone who displayed such callous disregard for vulnerable people. Sofia Gutierrez, by contrast, was receiving hundreds of messages praising her advocacy for the Henderson family. Nursing organizations were sharing her posts as examples of professional advocacy in action, and she was being offered job interviews from healthcare systems that had seen her compassionate response to a medical crisis. James Taylor's follower count had exploded from 50,000 to over 300,000 in a single day, with major media outlets offering him exclusive interview opportunities about his documentation of the incident. His travel blog had become a citizen journalism platform that had changed the conversation about airline accountability. As passengers began disembarking, they were met by a phalanx of reporters, cameras, and investigators that stretched throughout the terminal concourse. The story had grown far beyond airline customer service to encompass broader questions about disability rights, corporate culture, and social media accountability. Eleanor and Robert Henderson were escorted by medical personnel and airport security to a private area where they could receive care away from the media chaos. Eleanor's daughter Sarah was flying in from Seattle to provide additional support, having watched her parents' ordeal unfold on live television. Mrs. Henderson said Dr. Patricia Williams from the Disability Advocacy Center, "We want you to know that your experience today is going to help millions of other passengers with disabilities. Your courage in speaking up even when the crew dismissed you has created an opportunity for meaningful change." Eleanor nodded, exhausted but grateful. "I just wanted Robert to be safe and comfortable. I never imagined that asking for basic accommodation would become national news." "That's exactly the problem," Dr. Williams replied. "Basic accommodation should never require courage or create controversy. But because it does, because passengers like Robert are routinely ignored or dismissed, your story is forcing the entire industry to confront how they treat vulnerable travelers." Amara Brooks disembarked the aircraft to face a media environment unlike anything she'd experienced in her executive career. Dozens of reporters shouted questions as she walked through the jet bridge, flanked by corporate security and legal representatives. "Ms. Brooks, did you witness discrimination on your own airline? Will there be terminations as a result of today's incident? How long has this kind of behavior been tolerated at Skyline Airways? What's your response to calls for federal investigation?" Amara stopped at a designated press area and addressed the crowd directly. "Today, I witnessed failures in customer service, disability accommodation, and basic human decency that are unacceptable at any airline, but particularly unacceptable at an airline I have the responsibility to lead," she began. The Henderson family deserved better. Every passenger on Flight 847 deserved better. And every person who has been dismissed, mocked, or ignored by airline personnel deserves better than the culture we've allowed to develop. Her statement was broadcast live across multiple networks and shared instantly across social media platforms. The unprecedented sight of a CEO taking immediate personal responsibility for customer service failures was generating positive coverage that partially offset the devastating viral videos of crew behavior. Effective immediately, we are implementing comprehensive changes to our accommodation policies, crew training programs, and accountability measures. The employees whose behavior you witnessed today will be held responsible for their actions. But, more importantly, we will be rebuilding our corporate culture from the ground up to ensure that dignity and respect are not just company values, but operational requirements. Back inside the terminal, federal investigators were beginning their formal review of the incident. Transportation Security Administration officials, Department of Transportation civil rights investigators, and Federal Aviation Administration safety inspectors were coordinating what would become one of the most comprehensive airline service investigations in recent history. Agent Maria Gonzalez from the DOT's Office of Civil Rights was reviewing video evidence that James Taylor and other passengers had provided voluntarily. This is the most clearly documented case of Air Carrier Access Act violation I've seen in 15 years, she told her colleague. The crew's refusal to provide reasonable accommodation, their dismissive attitude toward the passengers' medical needs, and their active mockery of federal law requirements provide grounds for significant regulatory action. Meanwhile, Skyline Airways' stock price was experiencing unprecedented volatility. Initial reports of the viral videos had caused a sharp decline, but Amara's direct intervention and immediate accountability had created a partial recovery as investors recognized the potential for authentic cultural change. Financial analysts were providing real-time commentary on business networks. What we're seeing here is crisis management at the executive level that could actually strengthen the company long-term if they follow through on their commitments to change. The CEO's decision to conduct undercover assessment shows a level of hands-on leadership that investors haven't seen in airline management for decades. This could be a watershed moment for airline customer service industry-wide if Skyline Airways demonstrates that accountability and cultural change are possible. Carmen Rodriguez was escorted through the terminal by airport security, not for her protection, but for the protection of others. The public anger directed at her was intense, though tempered by recognition that she had been junior to Brenda Martinez and had eventually attempted to intervene. Her phone contained dozens of voice messages from family members, friends, and former classmates who had seen the viral videos. Some offered support. Others expressed disappointment, but all recognized that her life had changed dramatically in the space of a single flight. As she reached the employee parking area, Carmen made a decision that would define her path forward. Instead of hiding from accountability, she called James Taylor directly. "Mr. Taylor," she said. When he answered, "This is Carmen Rodriguez from the flight. I know you're probably busy with interviews and everything, but I wanted to ask if I could make a statement about what happened today. On your platform, I want to take responsibility and explain how this culture develops. How good people can make terrible choices when they're afraid." James was surprised by the call, but immediately recognized the journalistic value of authentic accountability from someone who had been part of the problem. "Carmen, are you sure you want to do this?" "The public response has been pretty intense," I'm sure Carmen replied. "People need to understand how airline culture can corrupt judgment, how fear of authority can override moral compass. Maybe if I explain how I failed, it can help prevent other people from making the same choices." Her decision to provide voluntary testimony would become a crucial element in the federal investigation and a powerful example of individual accountability that would influence industry-wide training programs. As the immediate aftermath continued to unfold across social media news networks and federal agencies, one thing was clear: Flight 847 had become a catalyst for comprehensive change in airline customer service standards. The revolution that had begun with a laugh was about to transform an entire industry. The Skyline Airways Executive Conference Room at San Francisco International Airport had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom where careers would be decided and justice would be served. The sterile, beige-walled space with its oval table and uncomfortable chairs had never hosted a meeting with such high stakes or such comprehensive documentation of employee failure. Amara Brooks entered the room with the quiet authority of someone who had spent the last 6 hours documenting the most comprehensive breakdown of customer service standards in modern airline history. She carried a yellow legal pad filled with timestamps, exact quotes, policy violations, and federal law infractions that would serve as evidence for the terminations and prosecutions about to unfold. David Martinez sat beside her with 3 laptops displaying real-time social media analytics news coverage and federal investigation updates. The story was continuing to grow rather than diminish, with disability advocacy groups organizing nationwide protests and competitor airlines announcing immediate policy reviews. Maria Gonzalez from the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights occupied one end of the table, her recording equipment and documentation materials spread out like a prosecutor's case file. This wasn't just a corporate disciplinary meeting. It was a federal investigation into civil rights violations that could result in criminal charges. Captain Luis Rodriguez entered first, his uniform impeccable, but his face showing the strain of commanding a flight that had become a national scandal. 23 years of exemplary service hadn't prepared him for managing a crisis that he'd been completely unaware of until it was too late to prevent. First Officer Ashley White followed, carrying printouts of cabin communication logs that documented her attempts to alert the captain to passenger service issues that were being dismissed by the crew. Her evidence would prove crucial in establishing the timeline of institutional failure. Carmen Rodriguez walked in with her head down, her uniform wrinkled and her face showing the strain of 6 hours of public condemnation. She carried her own phone displaying hundreds of threatening messages from people who had watched her fail to stand up for the Henderson family when it mattered most. Brenda Martinez entered last, escorted by airport security. Her 18-year career was about to end in this room, and she seemed to understand the gravity of her situation for the first time. The confidence that had characterized her dismissive behavior toward passengers had evaporated completely. Michael Thompson had been invited to attend as a passenger witness, though his legal representation had advised him to prepare for potential liability related to his hostile comments toward elderly passengers with medical needs. Amara began by placing her phone in the center of the table and activating the recording function. "This meeting is being recorded for legal and regulatory purposes," she announced. "Present are myself, Amara Brooks, CEO of Skyline Airways, David Martinez, Crisis Management Director, Agent Maria Gonzalez from the Department of Transportation, Captain Rodriguez and First Officer White from Flight 847, flight attendants Carmen Rodriguez and Brenda Martinez, and passenger Michael Thompson." She opened her legal pad and began reading from notes that would destroy careers and reshape industry standards. "Ms. Martinez," Amara said, looking directly at Brenda, "according to my documentation and video evidence from multiple sources, you refused to provide reasonable accommodation for an elderly passenger with dementia in direct violation of the Air Carrier Access Act." Brenda's mouth opened, but no words came out. For 18 years, she'd been dismissing passenger complaints with impunity. She'd never imagined facing accountability at this level. "You then laughed at a passenger who cited federal disability law requirements," Amara continued. "Your laugh was captured on video and has been viewed by over 1 million people. How do you explain this behavior? I didn't know," Brenda stammered, then stopped. She'd been about to say she didn't know Amara was the CEO, but realized that admitting she would treat passengers differently based on their perceived status would only make her situation worse. "You didn't know what Ms. Martinez?" Amara asked calmly. "I didn't know the passenger had dementia," Brenda finally said, grasping for any explanation that might minimize her culpability. Agent Gonzalez looked up from her notes. Ms. Martinez, the passenger's wife, clearly stated multiple times that her husband had dementia and required accommodation. This was documented by at least 6 different recordings from multiple passengers. Amara pulled out her phone and played a video clip that James Taylor had shared with the airline. Brenda's voice echoed through the conference room. "He'll just have to manage for a few hours. I'm sure he'll be fine once we're in the air." The words sounded even more callous in the sterile conference room environment than they had in the chaotic aircraft cabin. "Ms. Martinez," Amara said, "you told a dementia patient that he would have to manage separation from his caregiver. You dismissed federal accommodation requirements. You laughed at passengers who advocated for basic disability rights. How do you justify this behavior?" Brenda looked around the room, desperately seeking support or understanding from colleagues who had watched her create a national scandal through casual cruelty. "I've been flying for 18 years, Brenda said, her voice cracking. "I've dealt with thousands of passenger complaints. You develop a thick skin. People always want special treatment, always have sob stories." "Sob stories." Agent Gonzalez repeated, her voice sharp with professional outrage. "Ms. Martinez, you're referring to legally protected disability accommodations as sob stories." "No, Brenda realized she was making her situation worse with every word. "I mean, sometimes passengers exaggerate their needs to get better seats or special treatment." Amara leaned forward. "Ms. Martinez Robert Henderson is an 84-year-old Vietnam veteran with diagnosed dementia. His wife Eleanor has been his caregiver for 6 years. They had medical documentation of his condition. In what way did they exaggerate their needs?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Brenda had no answer because there was no answer. She had treated a legitimate medical accommodation request as an inconvenience and had mocked passengers who advocated for federal law compliance. Ms. Rodriguez Amara said, turning to Carmen, "You witnessed all of this behavior. You heard Ms. Martinez refuse accommodation, dismiss medical needs, and laugh at disability law requirements. Why didn't you intervene?" Carmen looked up with tears in her eyes. "Because I was afraid," she said honestly. "I was afraid of challenging Brenda's authority, afraid of making waves, afraid of losing my job. I knew what was happening was wrong, but I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to fix it." Her admission of cowardice was devastating but authentic. Agent Gonzalez made notes about institutional culture that creates fear of reporting discriminatory behavior. Miss Rodriguez Amara continued, "When you finally did speak up, it was too late to prevent Mr. Henderson's medical episode. How do you feel about that?" "Ashamed," Carmen replied immediately. "Completely ashamed. I became a flight attendant because I wanted to help people, but when people needed help, I was too scared to provide it. Mrs. Henderson looked at me for support, and I looked away. That's something I'll have to live with." Amara turned to Captain Rodriguez. "Captain, were you aware that your crew was refusing federal accommodation requirements?" "No, ma'am," Captain Rodriguez replied. "The first I heard of any passenger service issues was when ground operations contacted us about media attention. The crew never escalated the situation to the flight deck. First Officer White Amara said you attempted to get status updates from the crew. What were you told?" Ashley consulted her notes. "I was told that everything was under control when clearly it wasn't. I should have pressed for more detailed information about the passenger service issues." Amara pulled out a printed copy of James Taylor's Viewer Analytics. "Ladies and gentlemen, your behavior on Flight 847 was witnessed by over 1 million people in real time. This incident has become a case study in airline industry failure that will be referenced in business schools, legal proceedings, and regulatory policy for years to come." She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the airport tarmac where news crews were still broadcasting live coverage of the story. Ms. Martinez Amara said without turning around, "Your employment with Skyline Airways is terminated immediately. Effective now. Security will escort you from the premises. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address." Brenda's face went white. After 18 years, her career was ending in a corporate conference room while being recorded for legal proceedings. Ms. Rodriguez Amara continued, "You will not be terminated, but your employment as flight crew is ended immediately. You'll be transferred to ground operations with a 40% pay reduction and mandatory retraining. Your future with this company depends entirely on your ability to demonstrate genuine commitment to passenger advocacy." Carmen nodded, accepting the consequences of her failure to act when action was required. "Mr. Thompson," Amara said finally, turning back to face the room, "you mocked elderly passengers with medical needs while they were experiencing distress. Your behavior contributed to a hostile environment that exacerbated Mr. Henderson's medical episode. You're permanently banned from Skyline Airways." We will not transport passengers who treat vulnerable travelers with contempt. Michael Thompson's face flushed red. You can't ban me for expressing my opinion as a passenger, actually, Agent Gonzalez interjected. Airlines have broad authority to refuse service to passengers whose behavior creates hostile environments for other travelers. Your comments about medical accommodations being drama and manipulation contributed to the discrimination Ms. Martinez was perpetrating. The meeting was winding down, but the consequences were just beginning. Federal investigation media scrutiny, industry-wide policy changes, and comprehensive cultural transformation at Skyline Airways would continue for months. But in that sterile conference room, justice had been served with swift, clear consequences for everyone who had failed to uphold basic human dignity. The termination of Brenda Martinez became effective at 4:47 p.m. Pacific Time, exactly 18 years and 7 months after she'd been hired by Skyline Airways as an enthusiastic 27-year-old who genuinely wanted to help passengers travel safely and comfortably. Her security badge was deactivated. Her corporate credit cards were canceled, and her access to employee facilities was revoked within minutes of Amara's announcement. Airport security escorted her through the terminal while news cameras captured her exit, creating the definitive image of accountability that would be featured on front pages and news broadcasts around the world. The woman who had laughed at disability accommodation requests was now facing the consequences of casual cruelty in the most public way possible. Her termination letter, which would be filed with the Department of Transportation as part of their investigation, detailed every violation of company policy, federal law, and basic human decency that had occurred during the 47 minutes of crisis aboard Flight 847. Carmen Rodriguez's reassignment to ground operations represented a different kind of accountability, the opportunity for redemption through service to the passengers she had failed to protect. Her new supervisor, Maria Santos, was a 20-year veteran of airport operations who specialized in helping employees understand the human impact of their professional choices. Carmen Maria said as they walked toward the gate services area, "Your job is going to be handling rebooking for passengers with special needs, disability accommodations, and medical emergencies. Every single day you're going to help people like the Henderson family navigate airline travel safely and with dignity." Carmen nodded, understanding that her punishment was also her path toward atonement. "I want to learn how to be better. I want to understand how I failed so I never fail anyone like that again." "Good," Maria replied. "Because we're going to start with mandatory training on the Air Carrier Access Act, sensitivity training with disability advocacy groups, and direct mentorship with families who travel with medical conditions. You're going to understand exactly what the Henderson family went through, and you're going to help prevent it from happening to anyone else." Michael Thompson's permanent ban from Skyline Airways was implemented immediately in the company's passenger reservation system. His frequent flyer status was revoked, his accumulated miles were forfeited, and his name was flagged in the no-fly database with a notation about hostile behavior toward passengers with medical needs. But the consequences extended far beyond airline travel. His consulting firm, Thompson Strategic Solutions, was hemorrhaging clients as corporate executives distanced themselves from someone who had displayed such callous disregard for vulnerable people in a highly public setting. By the end of the business day, he had lost contracts worth over $400,000 in annual revenue, and his company's reputation had been so damaged that recovery would require years of effort and authentic change in his approach to business relationships. The Henderson family's compensation package was comprehensive and immediate. Eleanor and Robert's round-trip tickets were refunded in full. Their hotel accommodations were upgraded to a luxury suite with medical support staff, and they were granted lifetime platinum status with guaranteed accommodation for Robert's medical needs. But more significantly, Skyline Airways established the Henderson Family Foundation with an initial funding of $2.5 million to advocate for elderly travelers with cognitive conditions and to develop industry-wide standards for dementia-friendly air travel. Eleanor Henderson's first statement to the media was gracious but firm. "We don't want money or special treatment. We want other families to never experience what we went through today. If our terrible experience can help create better policies for other people facing cognitive decline, then something good will have come from something very painful. The federal investigation moved with unprecedented speed. Agent Maria Gonzalez filed preliminary findings within hours of the conference room meeting, citing clear violations of the Air Carrier Access Act, failure to provide reasonable accommodation, discriminatory treatment of passengers with disabilities, and institutional culture that enabled bias against vulnerable travelers. This case represents the most clearly documented example of airline disability discrimination. We've seen Agent Gonzalez told reporters. The video evidence, witness testimony, and corporate response provide a comprehensive record of both institutional failure and immediate accountability. The Department of Transportation announced that Skyline Airways would face regulatory sanctions, mandatory compliance monitoring, and required implementation of enhanced disability accommodation procedures across all operations. But they also acknowledged that Amara Brooks's direct intervention and immediate termination of responsible employees demonstrated the kind of executive accountability that could serve as a model for industry-wide cultural change. James Taylor's documentation of the incident had evolved from travel blogging to investigative journalism that was being cited by news outlets, regulatory agencies, and academic institutions studying corporate accountability in the social media age. His follower count had grown from 50,000 to over 500,000 in a single day, and he was being offered positions at major news networks that recognized the value of citizen journalism in documenting corporate behavior. What happened on Flight 847 wasn't just poor customer service, James said in his follow-up broadcast. It was a window into airline culture that passengers rarely see. The fact that a CEO was there to witness it firsthand, and that millions of people could watch it unfold in real time, created a level of accountability that the industry has never experienced before. Sofia Gutierrez received job offers from 3 major hospital systems and 2 disability advocacy organizations that had been impressed by her professional advocacy for the Henderson family. Her nursing colleagues were sharing her posts as examples of healthcare advocacy in action, and she was being invited to speak at conferences about patient advocacy in transportation settings. "I just did what any healthcare professional should do," Sophia said when contacted by reporters. "When you see someone in medical distress, you provide assistance. When you see discrimination against people with disabilities, you speak up. That's not heroic. That's basic professional responsibility." The stock market response to the crisis was complex but ultimately positive. Skyline Airways' stock had initially dropped 8% when the viral videos began circulating, but had recovered to close only 2% down after investors recognized that immediate executive accountability and comprehensive cultural change could strengthen the company long-term. Financial analysts were providing commentary that recognized the unprecedented nature of CEO-level crisis management. "What we're seeing here is a level of hands-on executive leadership that's extremely rare in airline management," said aviation industry analyst Rebecca Chang. The CEO's decision to conduct undercover assessment and then take immediate personal responsibility for failures represents the kind of authentic leadership that can transform corporate culture. Wall Street Journal business reporter David Kim noted, "Skyline Airways is facing significant regulatory sanctions and reputation damage, but their response has been so swift and comprehensive that they could emerge stronger than competitors who haven't addressed their own cultural problems." The industry-wide impact was immediate. Within hours of the story-breaking, Delta Airlines announced enhanced disability accommodation training for all employees. American Airlines revealed they were reviewing their policies for passengers with cognitive conditions. Southwest Airlines committed to implementing real-time feedback systems for passenger accommodation requests. The revolution in airline customer service standards that had begun with Brenda Martinez's dismissive laugh was spreading throughout the industry faster than any regulatory mandate could have achieved. But the most significant impact was still to come: the comprehensive transformation of Skyline Airways that would establish new standards for corporate accountability, employee training, and passenger advocacy that would influence business practices far beyond the airline industry. The Henderson family's terrible experience had become the catalyst for change that would protect millions of vulnerable travelers for decades to come. 3 months after Flight 847 landed at San Francisco International Airport, Skyline Airways had become unrecognizable as the company that had allowed Brenda Martinez to laugh at disability accommodation requests. The transformation was so comprehensive and authentic that business schools were already developing case studies about crisis-driven cultural change in large organizations. The Brooks Protocol, named after the CEO who had witnessed the failures firsthand, established new standards for passenger accommodation that went far beyond federal requirements. Every Skyline Airways employee, from baggage handlers to senior pilots, completed 40 hours of mandatory training on disability awareness, cultural sensitivity, and customer advocacy. But this wasn't typical corporate sensitivity training filled with generic scenarios and checkbox compliance. The program featured real footage from Flight 847 testimony from the Henderson family and direct involvement from disability advocacy organizations who helped design curriculum that addressed actual discrimination patterns rather than theoretical problems. Carmen Rodriguez had become the program's most powerful instructor. Her transformation from silent bystander to passionate advocate provided authentic credibility that no consultant or trainer could match. Standing in front of classes filled with flight attendants, gate agents, and customer service representatives, she shared the painful details of her failure to speak up when it mattered most. "I want you to see this video," Carmen would say, playing footage of her standing silently while Brenda dismissed the Henderson family's medical needs. "I want you to watch me choose my job security over a vulnerable passenger's dignity. I want you to understand how easy it is to become complicit in discrimination when you're afraid to challenge authority." Her presentations were devastating and effective. Employee feedback consistently rated her sessions as the most impactful part of the training program, and turnover in customer service positions dropped dramatically as workers felt empowered to advocate for passengers without fear of retaliation. The Passenger Voice Initiative installed feedback tablets in every seat back across the Skyline Airways fleet, allowing passengers to report accommodation failures, discriminatory treatment, or exceptional service in real time. The reports went directly to a dedicated response team that could address problems immediately, rather than waiting for post-flight surveys that were often ignored. Within the first month, the system identified 17 instances of potential bias or accommodation failure, allowing the airline to correct problems before they escalated into viral social media incidents. The Transparency Dashboard published monthly summaries of all reports, including detailed descriptions of how each issue was resolved. The Federal Aviation Administration cited the system as a model for proactive passenger advocacy that other airlines should adopt industry-wide. Sofia Gutierrez had been hired as Skyline Airways' first Director of Medical Advocacy, a position created specifically to ensure that passengers with health conditions received appropriate accommodation and support. Her nursing background and her advocacy during the Henderson crisis made her uniquely qualified to bridge medical needs with airline operations. Her team developed protocols for handling everything from severe allergies to cognitive conditions to mobility limitations, with specific training for crew members on recognizing medical emergencies before they became crises. The position had been funded through the Henderson Family Foundation, creating a direct link between the family's terrible experience and comprehensive improvements in medical accommodation. "What happened to the Hendersons can't happen again," Sophia said at the program launch. "Not just at Skyline Airways, but anywhere in the industry. Passengers with medical needs shouldn't have to fight for basic accommodation. It should be automatic, professional, and compassionate." James Taylor had been offered a position as Skyline Airways' social media transparency officer, tasked with monitoring online conversations about passenger experiences and ensuring that customer service failures were addressed immediately. His background in travel documentation and his role in exposing the original crisis made him ideally suited for preventing future incidents. His daily reports tracked customer sentiment, identified potential service problems, and provided early warning of issues that could escalate into larger crises. The position represented a revolutionary approach to corporate accountability, with a former critic now working inside the organization to maintain standards. "I never thought I'd work for an airline," James said in his first internal presentation, "but Skyline Airways has demonstrated that they're serious about change. My job is to make sure they stay serious about it." The industry-wide impact continued to expand beyond airline operations. Hospitality companies began implementing similar real-time feedback systems. Healthcare organizations studied the Brooks Protocol for improving patient advocacy. Corporate training programs across multiple industries incorporated lessons from the Henderson crisis. Harvard Business School professor Dr. Patricia Williams used the case as the foundation for a new course on crisis management and cultural transformation, noting that Skyline Airways demonstrated how authentic leadership accountability can transform institutional failure into industry advancement. Her research found that companies implementing similar transparency and advocacy programs experienced significant improvements in customer satisfaction, employee engagement, and brand reputation that translated into measurable financial performance improvements. The Henderson Family Foundation had grown beyond airline advocacy to support research on travel accommodations for people with cognitive conditions. Eleanor Henderson had become a spokesperson for elderly travel rights, sharing her story at conferences and policy meetings, while advocating for comprehensive accommodation standards across all forms of transportation. "Robert and I never wanted to become advocates," Eleanor said at the Foundation's first annual conference. "We just wanted to visit our daughter safely and with dignity. But if our experience helps other families avoid what we went through, then something meaningful has come from something very painful." Robert's condition continued to decline, but his subsequent flights on Skyline Airways were handled with such professional care and accommodation that other airlines began studying their protocols for serving passengers with dementia and other cognitive conditions. The Department of Transportation had completed its investigation with findings that praised Skyline Airways' response while establishing new regulatory requirements for disability accommodation across the airline industry. The Brooks Protocol became the foundation for updated federal guidelines that made passenger advocacy and real-time accommodation mandatory rather than optional. Agent Maria Gonzalez noted in her final report, "This case represents a watershed moment in transportation civil rights. The combination of documented discrimination, immediate corporate accountability, and comprehensive cultural change provides a blueprint for addressing institutional bias in service industries." 6 months after the incident, Skyline Airways' customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, not because their planes were faster or their prices were lower, but because passengers felt seen, respected, and valued regardless of their appearance, medical needs, or background. The airline's reputation had been completely transformed from a cautionary tale about customer service, failure to a model for corporate accountability and cultural change that business leaders across industries were studying and implementing. Flight attendants reported higher job satisfaction because they felt empowered to advocate for passengers rather than simply enforce policies. Gate agents received recognition and advancement opportunities for identifying and addressing accommodation needs. Customer service representatives were trained to see problem-solving as their primary responsibility rather than complaint deflection. Amara Brooks had established herself as a CEO whose leadership style prioritized authentic accountability over damage control, comprehensive change over superficial policy adjustments, and long-term cultural transformation over short-term stock price management. Her approach to crisis management became the subject of business school case studies, leadership development programs, and corporate governance, best practices that extended far beyond airline operations. What we learned from Flight 847, Amara said in her keynote address at the National Transportation Conference, is that cultural change is possible when leaders are willing to witness failure firsthand, accept responsibility completely, and commit to transformation authentically. You can't fix what you won't acknowledge, and you can't improve what you won't measure. The revolution that had begun with Brenda Martinez's dismissive laugh had become a comprehensive transformation of how service organizations treat vulnerable customers, how corporations respond to cultural failures, and how individual accountability can drive institutional change. The Henderson family's terrible experience had created better travel experiences for millions of passengers who would never know their names but would benefit from their courage to speak up when speaking up was difficult. 6 months later, Amara Brooks stood in the same airport terminal where her transformation of Skyline Airways had begun. But everything had changed. Gate K-17 buzzed with the efficient activity of employees who understood that passenger advocacy was their primary responsibility, not an inconvenience to manage. She watched Eleanor and Robert Henderson approach their departure gate for another visit to their daughter. But this time, their experience was seamlessly professional. The gate agent recognized their names, confirmed Robert's medical accommodation automatically, and personally ensured they were seated together with additional space for Eleanor's caregiver equipment. Mrs. Henderson, the agent, said warmly, "Your priority boarding passes are ready, and the crew has been briefed about Mr. Henderson's needs. Is there anything else we can provide for your comfort today?" Eleanor's smile was radiant with relief and gratitude. The difference between this treatment and their previous experience was profound, representing not just policy changes but authentic cultural transformation that prioritized human dignity above operational convenience. Carmen Rodriguez approached their gate wearing her new uniform as senior passenger advocate, a position that allowed her to help travelers with special needs navigate the airport experience with professional support and genuine compassion. She had become living proof that individual failure could be transformed into meaningful service when authentic accountability met comprehensive training. The industry-wide changes had spread far beyond airline operations. Hotels, restaurants, retail companies, and healthcare organizations had implemented similar transparency programs and advocacy training initiatives, creating a ripple effect of improved customer service that touched millions of interactions daily. Brenda Martinez's 5-second laugh had created a $50 million transformation that redefined how service industries treat vulnerable customers, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of cruelty create the largest opportunities for positive change. If this story moved you, if you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button to show that stories of accountability and justice matter to you. Second, subscribe to this channel because we're committed to sharing more stories where ordinary people stand up for what's right and create extraordinary change. And third, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice has power, that standing up for others matters, and that sometimes the person you're defending today might be the one who changes everything tomorrow. The Henderson family's courage in speaking up when it was difficult created a better world for millions of travelers. Your courage to speak up in your own life could do the same. Don't underestimate the power of doing what's right even when no one is watching. Because sometimes someone is watching, and sometimes that someone has the power to change everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring, and remember that dignity isn't negotiable. It's a human right that we all have the responsibility to protect.